Welcome and thank you for joining us for Show Me the Money, How the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act will benefit public projects this morning. Before we begin, we want to go over a few housekeeping items. We will email you links to download the slideshow and access the recording to this session tomorrow. If you have any questions during the webinar, please send them to us by clicking the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom window. We will have Q&A after our prepared presentation to address live questions and questions we received before the webinar. After the webinar concludes, you'll see a survey for our program. If you have a minute, we would love your feedback on today's program. This program has been approved for 1 hour of general CLE credit. If you'd like credit for today's presentation, please note that you must attend the entire webinar and answer all of our periodic polling questions that you'll see throughout the presentation. Based on what you requested during registration, we'll send you an MCLE and or generic completion certificate within a week after we verify your attendance. So my name is Artin Shaverdian. I'm a partner in Nossaman's Eminent Domain Valuation and Real Estate Practice Group. I represent public agencies on the real property matters, including acquisition of right-of-way for infrastructure projects throughout the country. I will be moderating today's panel of speakers who will be discussing the new $1.2 trillion Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act bill. Shant Boyajian is a partner of mine in our Washington, D.C. office. He's in our infrastructure practice group. Shant advises public agencies on a range of innovative methods to procure and deliver the nation's largest and most complex infrastructure projects. He provides valuable experience in P3 delivery methods, including some revenue, risk, and availability payment models, pre-development agreements, and other forms of alternative delivery, such as construction manager, general contractor, and design build. He previously served as a senior counsel to the U.S. Senate Committee on Environmental and Public Works, where he led the development of the FAST Act, which provided more than $300 billion in funding for surface transportation programs. Michael Stroud is a partner in Nossaman's Government Relations and Regulation Practice Group. Michael has more than 15 years of legal and legislative policy expertise in transportation, infrastructure, cybersecurity, national security, and federal, state, and local municipal government. He served as Deputy Chief Counsel in the U.S. House of Representatives and a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Legislative Affairs at the Department of Homeland Security in the Obama administration. Michael's time on Capitol Hill and in the Obama administration led to his experience overseeing legislation, creating and improving significant federal funding and grant programs. Michael provides federal government relations and legal services to a variety of clients, including multimodal transportation and urban redevelopment projects, brick and mortar and online retailers, private sector entities, not-for-profit entities, and governmental and quasi-governmental entities. Fred Easton is a professional land surveyor in Denver, Colorado with Farnsworth Group. Fred holds the International Right-of-Way Association's Senior Right-of-Way Professional and Real Estate Asset Management certifications. Managing both traditional surveying and real estate management and acquisition projects, Fred bridges the gap between engineering and real estate for infrastructure development and public facility projects. Fred currently serves as the International Treasurer on the Executive Board for the IRWA and as a liaison to various committees and partner agencies. Fred recently wrote the cover story in the January-February issue of the IRWA magazine on the infrastructure bill, so be sure to read this article if you have not. At this time, I would like to introduce Shant Boyajian, hand it off to Shant so that he can provide some general background and information regarding the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act bill and put it all into context as we continue to discuss the act.
Thank you so much, Artin, and thank you everybody for joining us today. It's a pleasure to be with you. So you've probably heard there's an Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law, as it's otherwise known. Yeah, exciting to talk about this with you today. Before we dive into this, let's go to a polling question. I'm curious, just to get a sense kind of where everyone's thinking, what impact do you expect the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act to have on your industry? I know we've got a diverse group with us today, so I think that would be an interesting point here. So we've got a significant impact, moderate impact, low impact, or you're not sure. So go ahead and take a moment and complete that. We'll give everybody another moment to finish submitting those responses. Great. So about half of you said that this new law will have a significant impact on your industry. About a third said moderate, and then low industry and unsure were kind of the split between the remainder. So I think it's interesting and good context for what we're going to be discussing today. So it's important to understand that this law, as Artin mentioned, provides about $1.2 trillion in total spending, but it's very interesting in that it has two different but complementary components to it, which are unique in kind of the history of surface transportation infrastructure laws. The first is a long-term 5-year authorization of federal surface transportation infrastructure, as well as an authorization of energy, broadband, and other types of infrastructure classes. And again, these are federal programs that provide federal money to improve these infrastructure classes across the country. In addition, the unique part about this bill in particular is Division J of the bill. And this is a direct appropriation of additional federal funding for a lot of these types of infrastructure classes that are already authorized in the first section of the bill, but also provides its own funding for some unique programs as well. So you've got these two different components. The first component is the authorization, and the second component is actually a direct appropriation of federal funds. Typically, when you have an infrastructure bill, there is basically an authorization. So you basically say, here's what the programs are going to look like. Here's the amount of money that's eligible to be allocated for these programs. And then typically there's a separate appropriations action that the federal government needs to take, that Congress needs to take to actually provide the funding for those programs. The difference here is that in Division J, the bill actually directly appropriated in addition to making those authorizations. So I think that's a key distinction that we're going to be talking about throughout today's presentation. So $1.2 trillion overall. This includes both the authorized amounts as well as the direct appropriation amounts. For the authorization itself, this provides roughly $350 billion for the federal highway program. This is a roughly 50% increase over previous spending levels. It also provides over $100 billion for the federal transit program. For the highway program, the bill created new programs focused particularly on bridges and electric vehicles. It also modified some of the existing programs that focus on other core highway infrastructure. The majority of these funds are distributed through the formula programs. This is the way that the federal highway program typically operates, where the majority of these funds go out automatically each year to each state Department of Transportation and the District of Columbia Department of Transportation. And it provides some certainty over the next 5 years for these state DOTs to actually plan and program their capital program. There are some additional grant programs that were created in the bill that are eligible for highway projects. And as we're going to be talking about, while a significant portion of this overall funding for the highway and the transit components go out by formula, there is an increase in this bill in the amount of discretionary funding that go out by direct grants that project sponsors can apply for and then receive from the federal government, which are distinct from the typical formula way that federal funding is allocated. In transit, there's a really notable increase to the capital investment grants program. And this is the program that core transit agencies really rely on to expand their system and for state of good repair and improvement of their existing capacity of their current programs. And so this really goes out towards capital improvements that are lumpier, so to speak, not talking about things that each transit agency is going to look at on a recurring basis year after year, but large projects that are kind of delivered over a 4 or 5 year period, typically. In addition, the bill also provides $550 billion in that direct appropriation that I mentioned in Division J, and that's eligible to be spent on highway projects, bridges, mass transit, and a variety of other types of infrastructure classes. So how did we get here? I think it's important to just have a little bit of context. And as you may remember, infrastructure was one of the top priorities that President Biden had during his campaign and then after he took office. After COVID, this was really the first thing that he really focused on. And so he unveiled his version of the infrastructure bill, his plan for the infrastructure bill in March of last year, just under a year ago, which was a roughly $2 trillion recommended investment. But as we know, just what the president proposes doesn't mean that that's how things are going to shake out in Congress. And so the House actually moved first, and they had actually passed their own version of the infrastructure bill in the last year of the Trump administration. They basically dusted off what they had already done and kind of repassed it through the House in July. This was known as the Invest in America Act. And, it had some of the president's priorities baked into it, but it really was, quite similar to what the House had already done the year previous. The Senate passed its version of the infrastructure bill. This is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act in August. And the expectation at the time was that the House and the Senate were going to go through a typical process where they would conference the bills together, create a compromise package, and pass that package again through each chamber before sending it to the president. That was overcome by events, politically speaking, and ultimately what happened was the House just passed what the Senate had already done and sent that over to the president. And he signed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act into law on November 15th. So now that we are a few months into this process, the bill is law. So where are we going? Well, implementation has been underway from day one, and the federal agencies have done a lot of work, produced a lot of paper, kind of getting the implementation underway. And this is just a gargantuan task. I mean, if you think about what Artin mentioned, I had the privilege of working on the 2015 infrastructure bill, the FAST Act, which was at the time the largest infrastructure investment in history. The bipartisan infrastructure law is 4 times the size of what we passed in 2015. And so the amount of money that's going out the door under this bill is tremendous and historic. And so funding is starting to roll out. The U.S. Department of Transportation, for example, has released a number of notices of funding opportunity at this point, provided apportionment notices to the state DOTs and public transportation agencies. One point that I want to mention here, and this is a little bit of a nuanced point, but an important one. The implementation of the bipartisan infrastructure law, the IIJA, is connected to the ongoing government funding fight right now on Capitol Hill. And it's an interesting point because right now, the federal government is operating under a continuing resolution extending the funding from fiscal year 21. Well, FY21 did not have the new programs, several of the new programs that the bipartisan infrastructure law created. And so as a result, right now, the federal government actually does not have the authority legally to implement several of the new programs under the bipartisan infrastructure law. And so unless some of these programs had a direct appropriation, kind of creating them and providing funding for them under Division J, it's been slower to actually get some of these other programs rolling. Current federal funding ends on March 11th, and the expectation is that appropriators in both the House and the Senate will have a bill in place at that point, providing funding directly for the remainder of fiscal year 22. And so the hope is that under that omnibus appropriations legislation that we should see in the next couple of weeks here, that will actually, for the first time, provide direct funding for the remainder of these programs created for fiscal year 22 under the bipartisan infrastructure law. And Arden, yeah, I'll turn it back over to you. Happy to answer any questions and look forward to participating with the audience.
Yeah, thank you, Shant. I've actually got a couple of questions for you. And I suspect our attendees are going to want the answer to some of these questions. But how does an agency position itself at this point to obtain some of this funding? And does it matter what type of an agency it is?
That's a great question, Arten. We've been doing a lot of work, as Arten mentioned. He and I both support public agencies in our legal practice. We've had a lot of clients that have really been tracking this very closely and are looking at ways to position themselves in their capital program to maximize this opportunity. And so what I would say is carefully reviewing the capital program that each agency has, trying to think about it in the context of the different funding buckets that are in the new bill, is a really important way to match up and maximize the potential to actually access some of these funds. There are planning implications, financial management implications to all of this. But at the most basic level, doing this matching exercise between what programs and what needs the agency has, figuring out how to package those projects together in the most efficient way possible, and then identifying potential federal funding sources that may not have existed previously is a really important kind of initial step in that exercise.
I see. What about, and I'm throwing this out to all three of our panelists, but do we know whether funding is available for specific uses? For instance, is it for construction purposes as opposed to right-of-way acquisition? Would the funding apply to right-of-way acquisition? Are there any limitations to the use of the funds? Can an agency use to upgrade its fleet, its trains, et cetera, in a transit setting?
Yeah, Arten, I can kind of take the initial stab at that. The answer is kind of yes to all of the above. There are funding eligibilities in the bipartisan infrastructure law that apply to all of those things that you mentioned. I think it really depends on kind of the particular program that an agency might be looking at. Right-of-way acquisition, for example, might be eligible as part of a broader project. It may not necessarily be eligible on its own. The same for vehicle fleets. Some programs in the new infrastructure law are directed specifically to like expanding clean energy fleet vehicles. They may also be eligible as part of a broader package, especially in the transit realm. You may be able to package a vehicle procurement along with a broader capital plan, a broader capital project under the CIG program, for example, a capital investments grant program. So that's just one example where a lot of these types of activities may be eligible, but they might have to be packaged together in a certain way to kind of achieve funding success.
Totally agree. And on the right-of-way side, especially, that's something I've been very keen to dig into, and we are starting to see projects submitted under the guidance from the federal agencies. And many of them do have right-of-way components, appraisal components, and do have potential for eminent domain legislation or action.
Thanks, Fred. Michael, any thoughts?
Just to add that, to the point about creativity and flexibility with the funding notices that can be issued, we're already seeing that. We've seen DOT issue several different notices of funding opportunities in the last few weeks. We've also seen the Bureau of Reclamation issue a few to follow up on some WRDA authorizations. So the funding is going to be coming, and it's going to be coming as quickly as the administration can issue it.
Great. Thanks, Michael. I'm going to turn it over to Fred. He's going to talk a little bit more about some of the specific programs and their impacts on right-of-way in particular, and then we'll move on. Fred?
Thank you. All right, so I wanted to talk a little bit high level about it. You know, we've heard the term once in a generation. So, you know, I wanted to look into this and how do you analyze this, and is it really once in a generation? I think the answer is pretty clearly yes. So what I wanted to do was explore what that looked like as a percent of GDP, rather than having to deal with inflation of dollars. What percent of our workforce is really working on these things? And as a comparison, the Federal Highway Act was 0.06 of the percent of GDP when originally authorized, though that ramped up and was spending about $114 billion adjusted to current inflation, or 0.1, a little over 0.1 on average per year. Pretty big expenditure of our GDP. The Safety Lou, the Bush Transportation Bill signed in 2005, that was about 2% of our GDP across 4 years. And the ARA portion that was spent directly on infrastructure was just below 1% spent in 1 year. As a comparison, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is 5.2% of our estimated GDP for 2021. So across typically 5 years, depending on the program. So that's pretty significant, above 1% per year. And breaking it down a little bit, looking into it some more, we find that $641 billion to fund existing trust and project sources. That is not, and important to note that that's not necessarily 641 that was already allocated, that was already planned. There are many projects that were authorized. A good example is my own neighborhood, that make that list every year, that authorized in 1969, the Arkansas Valley Conduit has never been funded fully. So this time it looks to be funded. And then there was $559 billion in new programs and funding. And that's very significant. So a poll question here. What is your expectation that projects will be funded by the bill in your state territories you work in? I've been hearing a lot of buzzwords. And so what I broke this down is, do you think it's going to be shovel ready projects that are going to be funded? Do you think mostly shovel ready? Possibly a mix of shovel ready and those that need right-of-way pre-construction services, design, permitting, are going to be done under an alternate contract method like design build or CMGC? Or do you think it's mostly going to be those with the pre-design services, or finally all of them pre-design? Curious what you think and what you're hearing in your area. Give it just a second more. All right. So expectation is for a mix primarily, and I would agree with you generally from what I've seen, although we'll talk a little bit more about that. But so breaking this down some more, we have some winners, and I like to say lesser winners. I was my first, I think my article says winners and losers. And one of my clients who is a manager at a transportation authority pointed out to me that they still are receiving a huge amount of funding and don't really consider themselves losers. So winners and lesser winners. So roads and bridges, without a doubt, the biggest winner. This is the allocation of new funds on top of their already substantial funds like the Highway Trust Fund. A secondary, energy, power, and electric grid was a huge winner with new funding coming from federal agencies. A lot of it is loan funds, but quite a bit is not as well, especially studies. Many of the studies are grant, competitive grant, and not loan. Freight and transportation rail saw the largest funding since the creation of the passenger rail in the United States. Broadband, huge funding. They've seen a lot of federal acts lately, but this is the biggest funding in a 5-year period for broadband, and should have major impact on expansion of broadband across the entire US. Water and wastewater, again, big winner. And clean water, especially, and clean water to rural communities, something that Congress has talked about funding for decades and decades, but never spent a very large amount. Additionally, shoring up our safety of our waterways through USACE funds were a big winner in this category. And public transportation, that kind of a lesser winner. The original bill had a lot more in it and expanded the access of public transportation to Americans, which it's one of our worst failing infrastructure grades, according to the ASCE infrastructure report card, a D-. Unfortunately, this doesn't do anything to really expand that access, except for the northeast corridor. But what it does do is fund a lot of bus replacements and bus maintenance, converting over to a hybrid and electric fleet for climate change and climate action reasons. And the benefit of that is that's money that these transportation authorities had likely needed to spend over the next 20 years anyway. And instead, they'll be able to get new buses and upgrade that and spend their money toward the expansion of facilities and expansion of light rail lines. And then we have a variety of others there that received quite a bit of increased funds. All right. So looking at some of these, I wanted to highlight a couple key projects that could potentially impact the right-of-way acquisition industry and eminent domain litigators. The National Highway Performance Program, this funding amount, it's very high, $148 billion, and significant note that that's half of what SafetyLU, the Bush transportation bill, was. And that project is an existing fund increased that funds both road and bridge. So you're going to see winner in transportation. Bridges definitely are a winner in this funding, and many of these programs will have right-of-way impacts. Here's bridges again. The Bridge Formula program is new, is based on a risk management. So this is not so much going after the stimulus and safety funds. It's really, it's not going after stimulating the economy. It's going after the worst, most risky bridges in our country. And the Bridge Investment Program is very similar, but slightly different funding mechanism with competitive grants. Congestion Mitigation Air Quality Improvement Program will have likely be a lot of right-of-way. I've already seen 2 projects submitted by 2 different DOTs. In both cases, they were ramps that create congestion for a period longer than 1 hour every day. And they have a right-of-way component where the highway is already constrained and needs to do non-residential relocation and acquisitions to be able to install multi-lane on-ramps. I think we're going to see quite a bit of that in the metro areas. National Infrastructure Project Assistance Mega Projects, an interesting new fund that the guidance on this is supposed to be due out this month, getting close to the end of the month, and hopefully FHWA is getting close. But previously, mega projects were designed as 1 billion or more difficult to fund projects. So it doesn't look like this is going to fund a lot of projects, but as an example, a mega project here in Colorado, it's the I-70 corridor project, which had hundreds of acquisitions and relocations. So I would keep an eye on that and see who wins those projects. Rural Surface Transportation Grant Program, $1 billion for expanding. Once again, bridges is in this, as well as surface highways. A big component of this is it is supposed to be expansion. We're talking new roads or roads that it could be going from a gravel road to a paved road, potentially, depending on the use and definition. But I would expect a lot of new roads and new access to roads through this program. Continuing on in transportation, we have the Reconnecting Communities pilot program. I wanted to just highlight $1 billion. This is a very interesting program. It's a pilot, so keep track on this to see where it's going to go from here. The concept here is when you have a highway that divides two communities, reconnecting those communities possibly. And we've seen some plans of what's going to be submitted from Caltrans. TxDOT, I believe, has one they're prepping in my home state here in Colorado. I know of one. And the approaches on those almost always have some form of land real estate right-of-way component. Another one I just want to highlight, it's a little further down the list, 350 million, but it is pilot program for wildlife crossings. These are really fun projects. I'd keep an eye out for that. I've done several here in Colorado, and you know, the first time I heard about them, I was like, how are you going to get the, you know, sheep onto a bridge? How are you going to make sure they cross on that bridge? They do. It's pretty fascinating to watch, and watch the cameras they put on that bridge, the bears and cougars and everything else going across there. But those will be some really key, interesting projects. We have ports and waterways. The Corps of Engineers has a ton of projects, many of which will need right-of-way and easement acquisitions along our waterways and critical waterways. An interesting note, real property activities, not quite what you might expect. This is directly to the expansion of land ports, so port of entries. And it looks like a lot of it may be focused toward Texas and California. The energy sector, there's quite a few to look at here, but one of the ones that caught my eye was the clean hydrogen hubs. This is funding for, I believe, 5 new clean hydrogen hubs across the US. Not the big long mileage, but from a facility management standpoint and property management, these are very interesting projects. Another one is the transmission facility program. Unfortunately, this was a bit of a loser in the bipartisan negotiations. This funds transmission lines with the intent to bring the wind energy and solar resource from the middle of the United States out to the coastal, high populated areas. And there's still some funds in here to get that going, to see really is it going to work and how to fund that. But definitely more is needed if we are going to switch from coal to wind and solar. Water, there are a lot of funds here that have potential right of way. I won't go through all of them. But even the lead service line replacements project often require reconnecting to different water resource or changing the direction the water resource is connected. So even some of the ones that I've done under state allocation fundings here in Colorado have had transmission line changes and extensions that have required right-of-way and easements. There's quite a few in here as well. There's many dam programs and expansion of water and ground storage, which always has pipelines connecting between them. Broadband access and deployment program, while I would predict that the broadband continues to target existing public right-of-ways for most of their facilities, not requiring a lot of new easements, where I think it's important to the industry that IRWA is in, is our DOT managers and others that should have, hopefully you have your licenses program and permitting program in place to capitalize on those new lines and get them legally allowable within your right-of-way. And that's about it for me. I do want to cite sources, and you can point your camera at those, but a lot of the great information, if you want to get into those tables that I was showing you and more about those programs, how they're funded and what agency, the White House Building a Better America guidebook is a great source. And then the ASCE infrastructure report card can give you some more.
Thanks, Fred. And just so everyone knows, again, we will be sending out this presentation to everyone who's here today. And so you will receive not only the presentation with all of the charts and graphs and everything else that's in there, but you'll receive these QR codes as well as part of the presentation, so you can do that later. I do have a quick question, and this is for perhaps the entire panel. And I actually just received a question from one of our audience members, but my question was, do shovel-ready projects have an advantage or a priority for funding? And of course, the Q&A that we received, which is related to this, is what does shovel-ready mean? Most, if not all, of these projects related to this funding would require environmental studies and many different types of permits, such as Clean Water Act, Section 404 dredge and discharge permits, which can make more than a year to secure. And projects on state and federal lands would also require detailed environmental studies. Has this been considered in the funding and implementation of these projects?
Yeah, I'll take a first stab at that. One thing, shovel ready, the concept is that you could go to construction if you had the money. You also have a term shovel worthy that's being thrown around, which is that it could be done within the timeline of this funding, so 4 to 5 years. You could go to construction, but the concept there that you don't have a long environmental clearance process ahead of you, namely. Now, you won't find either of those terms in the bill anywhere. So what we're seeing right now is politicians are especially pushing the concept of shovel ready. And while this is not a stimulus bill, this is not a one-off like ARRA was. There's definitely a push by politicians to have a lot of projects under their belt, a lot of jobs, so that they can use that as political capital going into the midterm elections. But that said, the guidance that is being published on Federal Highway Authority, on Department of Interior, Bureau of Reclamation, USACE on some of these projects coming out and how to submit for the projects does not really highlight shovel ready. It definitely highlights a trying to get the project out in the next 4 to 5 years. And even within the bill itself, there is language about the obligation of funds in the 4th year of transportation funding, 5th year of some of the water fundings, which indicates the understanding that we might not spend all this money in 5 years, but if we have it ready to hand over to a contractor, at the end of that period, it's still allocated, funded, and we can move forward on those projects.
Yeah, I agree with Fred. I don't really have too much to add to that. I just think the key distinction is what Fred mentioned, that this is a different bill than the ARRA Recovery Act, and the purposes were different. And so I think the money under this legislation, the bipartisan infrastructure law, is designed to flow out a little bit more slowly for projects that are have been planned for the future, not just those that happen to be ready at the moment.
Gentlemen, one of the other things that I think our audience is wondering is, that we talked a little bit about sort of clear winners and losers in this infrastructure bill. Transit seems to have received a sort of a greater proportion of funding. Are there any other areas that agencies should be looking at that are clear winners and there just seems to be a lot of funding available, or at least allocated? And are there really clear losers also, where we may have needed something but there wasn't an allocation and perhaps some disappointment?
I think one of the ones that a lot of people were disappointed in, definitely, I mentioned it briefly, but the transit, public transportation, we're the lowest in industrialized nations for access to public transit, with less than, I believe, 43% of the United States citizens have access to it. And I think that access definition is something like 6 miles, which is a long way to walk to get to a bus. We definitely have a very low amount of access of public transportation compared to the rest of the industrialized world. And a lot of that funding was cut. But still, there's a lot of funding going to the transit authorities through the upgrade of buses and trains that should benefit in the long term. Another one is high-speed rail. We've been funding studies on high-speed rail for, I believe, 60 years, something like that. The concept of it, even before maglev existed. And we continue to do that. That's all that's in the bill, is funding of more further funding of studies, no expansion of any kind of high-speed rail or high-speed ground-based transit. And then the final one being oil and gas pipelines, midstream development, nothing in that industry at all. The energy sector funding are definitely focused on renewable, clean, and expansion of clean energy sources.
Speaking of which, we do have some questions about funding available for energy, but I think Michael's going to cover the funding and policy themes on energy and resilience. So I'll let Michael do his short presentation before we get into some of the Q&A that talks about energy and some of the other questions we've received that Michael is probably going to cover in his presentation. So Michael, please.
Sure. So as Artin said, thanks for being with us today. And the discussion on my section is mainly going to focus on the funding themes around clean energy and resilience. I think those are primarily if you were to take something away from this law, besides the transportation side of it, it's really those two concepts. As we move into the clean energy side, let's just talk about that briefly. The Department of Energy, the law has tons of funding for different types of energy projects, and what we're seeing is primarily a shift towards innovative funding and innovative technologies, in addition to just basic grid resilience and things of that sort. Given the catastrophic nature of the last couple of years of natural disasters, primarily storms. Last year we saw the ice storm that literally crippled and debilitated the Texas power grid and led to the loss of life. And the real desire there was to have some investment into these particular fixed assets that are going to be needed for Americans and others to, just to survive, and businesses and whatnot. So as we got into that, we can see that this bill is geared towards delivering that and ensuring that, but also trying to look at some innovative ways to arrive at energy, both generation, distribution, transmission, and storage. So, I think what really struck me as interesting is the same approach that was in the Obama administration. There's sort of all options of energy, are considered here. So we definitely see your solar and wind, but we also see the advanced nuclear reactors, mini reactors, things of that sort. And we really also see a lot of funding being geared towards these large demonstration projects. And that's one of the things that I think is really an opportunity for folks out there, is to look at how there might be an innovative project that really could draw the attention and the funding for the federal government. We also have a lot of we hear a lot about renewable energy investments. I think this bill actually takes it to, this law takes it to a different level. As my colleagues and co-panelists have said, that this is really a once in a generation type of legislation. So we see renewable energy put forth there as a primary tenet of it. And then obviously too, this is, I think, one of the points that may be missed here is that this is real, or not missed by my panelists, but just sort of one of the points people are not talking about is that this is really an attempt to try to move away from the just pure government direct funding to some project or entity someplace. It's really trying to move in this preferred delivery method of really engaging the public and the private sector to generate a better outcome. And so there's a preference for that type of delivery. And then, as I just said, I think what we see too is we're also really not just investing in the electric grid, but really trying to take that electric grid to a whole different level, if you will. And when we are looking at making the grid more resilient in different portions of the country, we realized after the Colonial Pipeline attack, and after, just like I said, natural disasters, we're seeing a need to really invest in the power grid, both regionally and nationally. Because when it's national, we have redundancy, and if it's intact regionally as well, you have built-in redundancy, so that you can lead to the next phase, which is resiliency. So when we look at wildfires, I know that there was a question asked about whether or not utilities would be eligible for funding for wildfire prevention. This particular law includes funding for state and local governments that were impacted by wildfires and other entities that were impacted by wildfires. So we're really looking at an effort here to try to mitigate and reduce the impact from some of these natural disasters, because they will just continue to happen. And then I think the other thing that we have to really look at is what are the themes of resiliency that are in this legislation. And we'll get to that in a second, but I have a poll question first. And that is, to be successful in an application for federal funding, do you need an outside consultant? And this is a question that has come up numerous times. We have a couple of choices here. The answer is yes. There's an answer of no, an answer of it depends, and an answer of unsure. So I want to give everybody a chance to think about that and provide us with your input. Okay, so a lot of the overwhelming response was it depends, and I think that's probably true. It depends on the type of project, and depends on the type of funding that you're seeking. So, so let's take a look at the other batch of funding that's the other theme in this bill, which is resilience. So let's take a look at that. So we see some key concepts here. The big ones that we see are climate impact. We talked about that. There's an area that I call the FEMA-related funding. These are the hazard mitigation and disaster response. There is by far, other than the Flint, Michigan water response, the water infrastructure funding in this bill is second to none. There's been a lot of talk about water infrastructure, and this bill and law really put money behind that. And then lastly, cybersecurity, which is going to play a crucial role in all of our critical infrastructure moving forward. Climate impact, we know the law has funding for coastal zone management, has some wetland restoration, reefs, barrier islands, all that sort of thing, all those sort of things that are normal for coastal zones. We have wildfire mitigation and response, which I mentioned before. Interesting too, there's a lot of funding here for Superfund and brownfield cleanups. I think that's a continuation of the concept of making, and creating more space and sort of livable places. And then we also have, I think it's worth noting that for the nuclear reactors that are already in use, that this law allows for funding for them as well. So I think those are some worthwhile and notable points in that this is a very pragmatic approach to creating additional resiliency for the power generation. And then of course we also have this large scale weatherization issue, which is really, we saw this, some of this was in the ERA bill as a stimulus, but it was very small scale and for energy efficient appliances and things of that sort. But this is really taking it to a very different level of looking for state, local entities that can really identify and try to mitigate the increased loss or the increased financial impact that we're going to see from weatherization. So FEMA related topics, we talked about this briefly, but flood mitigation and assistance, that's going to be huge. We see that happening. I think there are efforts here, instead of trying to put the river back into the banks, it's looking at, where's the new river going to be? How do we address those? So flood mitigation and assistance is going to be an ongoing issue that we're going to try that this law will fund and we'll try to address. The hazard mitigation loan fund is a new approach there. That's an interesting one, whereby we're trying to make the proverbial federal dollars go further and replenish the pot, if you will. Then on the water infrastructure side, we have the dam inspections, dam safety, that's a big one. WIFIA, we have our SRF funding, and we have pretty much all aspects of water covered. We have the we have clean water, storm water, drinking water, and a big one too for Western water in particular is water recycling. I think those are going to be really some interesting projects. And then we have cybersecurity. I'll end on this point alone. In this particular law, we saw a couple of different sectors that are not traditionally identified with cybersecurity. We saw the water sector receive direct authorization for funding, addressing cybersecurity, viewing now water and water infrastructure as critical infrastructure necessary. So I think that's one of the big steps forward. Having worked at a water utility, cybersecurity is not often thought of in some ways, but as time has evolved, and particularly SCADA systems and automated systems, we've come to see that the water sector needs to have resources for this. We also realize state and local governments have not had funding to necessarily conduct full cyber vulnerability assessments, and this law creates funding opportunities for them to do that, because it really is crucial to make sure that state and local governments can continue to operate. That is resilience in itself. And then of course we have a cyber response and recovery fund, which is those in the homeland space sometimes might refer to it as sort of a FEMA for cyber, if you will. But this is really intended to look at and provide funding for entities that are impacted by cyber events and to help them respond and to recover from those. So with that, I'll turn back over to you, Arden.
Thanks, Michael. I'm sort of going to take this full circle and go back to that polling question that you just had about consultants. But I guess my question is, when's funding available, first of all, and then what would be the application process? And the sort of going full circle to your polling question. So this is sort of a three-part question. And which one of these projects or programs would likely require the consultants? I mean, we talked about it depends, or that's sort of what the larger audience seemed to say, that it depends on what type. Do our panelists have any thoughts on, again, when is funding available? What's the process, the application process, and what is this depends? What types of projects and programs?
Yeah, I'll kick it off really quickly there and just say, I think in my experience with, for example, port infrastructure development programs and Tiger and some others, it really depends on the size of the scope of the grant and the funding that you're going for. If it's something as small as maybe a small security grant from DHS, that's you may not necessarily need a consultant, but if it's a more elaborate cost benefit analysis that you're needing to provide, then it's probably better, unless you have somebody on staff that is devoted to that, unless you have significant experience with that, or you've already staffed up to create and go attract the human resource and capital that you're going to need to do that work. You may need to use a consultant to know the ins and outs of some of these more intricate grant programs.
Yeah, I think I agree with Michael, and I think it's helpful to think about these potential grant awards kind of from the federal government's perspective. So the way this is going to essentially work is that there will be a solicitation for one of these discretionary programs. Could be port infrastructure, could be RAISE, which is kind of the new iteration of Tiger. It could be infra, which has a more freight-related focus, some multimodal eligibility, but primarily focused on highway nexus. It could be the new mega projects program, which is truly multimodal in nature. Each of these different programs will require a certain economic analysis as part of the application. But essentially what happens is, once these applications are received and the application window closes, at least on the US DOT side, for example, staff will review the applications, review the benefit cost analysis. They will ultimately arrive at a rating for the overall application, usually high, medium, low, that type of thing. And then all of those applications that receive a recommendation will move forward, and then the political leadership of the agency will then review them And so there's a multi-step process. Having a strategy in the way that you're writing your application that anticipates getting through each of those steps is going to be really key. And so if an agency has that capability in-house, there are a lot of very experienced agencies that understand this process intimately and have a lot of experience with it. You may not need to have a consultant helping you. There are several opportunities that are going to be available under this law that will open up possibilities for agencies that probably have not accessed federal funds before. And so for those agencies that may be a little bit newer to this, or for programs that have not been implemented before, having a professional help you through the process will probably increase your opportunity for success.
Thanks, gentlemen. So there's certainly a lot of funding and funding programs that are available under this act. So it sounds like for agencies and private entities to be in a position to actively sort of participate and take advantage, they really should be assessing a few things. It sounds like they should be looking at how their agency can benefit from this act, first of all. Which one of the funding programs will achieve their goals and what projects they've got in the pipeline. Maybe look for how to tie those benefits and goals and identify the right program to be seeking to fund those projects. And it sounds like P3 opportunities really are encouraged here. So entities should really be looking at trying to establish a public-private partnership in projects where they can do that. And of course, community support is always sort of very important. Anything else you guys would add as far as a takeaway before we hit some of the Q&A that we've received?
No, I don't think so. Not from me, Artin.
All right, so we had received some questions prior to this presentation today. Some of you had already emailed questions, so we'll go over some of those in the next few minutes. I know we're coming up on 12 o'clock here, and this was supposed to be an hour. So feel free to stick around. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible. And I've had a few that have also come up in our Q&A pop-up window here. We'll try to address them. And remember, this is recorded, so you'll receive a recording of it if you need to jump off and hear some of the Q&A and the responses later. You can do that. And of course, as I said earlier, we'll get you the presentations as well. Let me hit the first question, and we'll try to sort of go through this as a speed round so we can get to as many as possible. First question: if our local government had a recurring loss associated with a natural disaster such as flooding, is there funding to help the local government stop this loss?
Yes.
Yeah, the answer is yes, definitely. At least on the highway side, there's the emergency relief program specifically designed to help to address this. The only thing I would say is if it's truly a recurring issue, you may have some direction from Federal Highway Administration that this needs to be, addressed in your actual transportation plan and not as kind of a recurring annual emergency relief funding.
And I would say from the inland waterways, especially, I would look to the USACE or U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Their laundry list of projects that are getting funded and they're moving forward on. They recently had a press release about that, and many of those address flooding concerns, levees.
Why should my entity care about cybersecurity resilience, and what is in it for my entity? And I know you touched on this, Michael, so.
Sure. I'm happy to touch on it again. And the basic issue is that we have seen cyber attacks and cyber vulnerability become a greater and greater threat to most of the nations in the world's critical infrastructure. And as international events, hacking, cyber theft, cyber intrusion, as those activities increase, it's only logical that it's going to continue to move towards other critical infrastructure sectors. I mean, lest we forget, two Super Bowls ago, a cyber intrusion changed the chemistry of a drinking water plant in Tampa that luckily was detected before anything happened, but that was a cyber intrusion, and so that we definitely can see those kinds of attacks on the rise.
Yeah, and I think just for everyone's benefit, we also just posted a e-alert on the cybersecurity issue. So go to our website and you can read a little bit about that. Next question, is there any emergency relief funding for intercity rail programs?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, there's the money in the infrastructure law for intercity passenger rail. I mean, there's a tremendous amount in the bill for this. It primarily applies to new construction, new capital programs. I do not believe any of those new programs specifically designed to intercity rail really have an emergency relief component. So there may be other pots, and I'm not sure if Michael has any insight into some of the general kind of emergency relief eligibility for public infrastructure that might be applicable. But I don't believe that the new programs specifically around the Northeast Corridor and other types of the Fed-State partnership program specifically deal with emergency assistance.
I think that's right, Sean. There are a couple of maybe Homeland Security grants that may be eligible for certain functions in which an entity may be able to shift some money, but I think you addressed largely where they're available.
And there's been pretty substantial changes to the federal-state partnership for intercity passenger rail grants. So I think that's one worth watching to see how that develops within the Department of Transportation.
Question that just came up is, for shovel-ready projects, how would you promote equity and livability, especially for highway projects? Equity and environmental justice are new criteria, but the planning has been done. How could an agency position themselves?
Well, you have to take account for this in the environmental process. I mean, I think that is abundantly clear after the action with the highway, the interstate highway in Houston, that Secretary Buttigieg kind of requested to put on hold as a result of some of those particular issues. And so it's a very salient question, an important one. The administration's Justice 40 initiative is really looking at trying to dedicate up to 40% of additional infrastructure spending on those types of projects that would support and address historically disadvantaged communities. And so it's a great question. I mean, public agencies are going to have to take into account this issue if they're not already doing so during the environmental review process for these infrastructure projects.
I would add to that too. That's where even though you have your plans already in place, this is where your local support and documented local support, city councils, town councils, elected officials, mayors, et cetera. That's where you're going to also be able to at least find some additional support to bolster your position that perhaps your project does already address these concepts. But I agree with Sean that it's going to be picked up as well on the environmental side.
Yeah, I think the EAEIS process has gotten really good at this. Good example is I-70 here in Colorado and Denver. Failed the EIS to get a record of decision or a preferred alternative for many years because it divided a community further and eliminated their community center. And the final resolution was a connected bridge, basically a tunnel that the highway runs through, and a park and on top that keeps the community connected and the community center open.
So we just got one more question here with respect to right-of-way and funding, but let me read this real quickly and let's see if we've got an answer to this. Will a utility, if it receives federal funds, need to submit a right-of-way certification, including following the Uniform Relocation Act? We currently follow the MUD Act, which does not require us to pay for easements and does not require us to follow the URA. We often do not condemn for projects, but often redesign. Anyone?
That's a good question.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I mean, as a condemnation attorney who's been acquiring properties for a lot of public agencies, I suspect that if you're going to have federal funding and you're going to be utilizing new right-of-way or acquiring right-of-way, then you're going to have to certify and you're going to have to follow the Uniform Relocation Act. I'm not aware of any projects that we've done where there's been any type of federal funding involved that didn't require that we follow the URA. But again, that'll be a question at the time for for the sort of local partner agencies that you're working with, and whether wherever the funding is coming from to clarify that. But I don't think right now the bill has specificity to answer some of these questions.
And I can say on the on the development of broadband, there doesn't look to be a lot of hooks into the broadband companies for how they do that. And there was a question up above of would it be a full public utility? And I don't believe so. Everything looks like it would be continue to operate as we're operating now, and it's just helping those broadband companies access high cost areas of the states where it's difficult to get to.
All right, next question is, how is the infrastructure money distributed by state?
Yeah, I can take that one briefly. So at least with the highway and transit programs, the bulk of these funds go out by formula to the state DOTs, to the public transportation providers. Fred ran through several of the programs on the federal highway side. About half a dozen or so of those are quote unquote formula programs that really go out automatically based on different criteria. Those programs have different eligibility, but the purpose of this is for these project sponsors to have certainty for their transportation planning, to make sure that they can deliver their program and understand what partnership the federal government is going to have in providing funding for those projects. But then we talked about there's $100 billion in this bill that goes out by discretionary means. And so there is going to be an opportunity for significant access to federal funding across the board, whether it's a state DOT, a public transportation agency, other agency or municipality, to actually access funding that they haven't been able to before.
Thanks. One other question here is, for projects currently in the phases prior to approval construction, are there any tips for steps to take to better position the project to be eligible for funding under the Act?
Yeah, I mean, turn it over to Michael. It seems like he has a thought here. The only thing I would say briefly is that, I think that's part of what you need to be doing right now as a public agency, is thinking about your capital program, not in the way that you've currently got it sliced and diced, but thinking about it in the way of how are you going to maximize your opportunity to actually access federal funds now that you've got this new infrastructure law with new programs. And maybe some of your programs, or maybe some of your projects in your capital program, need to be reprioritized. Maybe some of them need to be combined. Maybe you need to focus on certain aspects of them to really maximize your opportunity to actually get funding for the design and construction of those projects.
Yeah, I would say too, in addition to that, a couple things. One is go back and look at your CIP and figure out if there are any projects that maybe you can that have joint resiliency, might have regional significance to them. Sometimes that can create a greater need to fund a project. We looked at that one time for providing drinking water redundancy from a drinking water plant to two different areas, and that elevated the project a little bit in its importance. The other one, of course, is making sure that what you can do now is make sure you have your local elected supporter supporting your project, including your business communities, your environmental communities, and making sure you have all the documented support for these projects. And like Sean said, you may decide to look at your projects differently and figure out perhaps there's a different grant fund that may still help you accomplish your funding goal, but maybe it's a project you hadn't really considered initially.
I've got a California specific question. How will California be prioritizing climate resiliency for infrastructure and natural resources in their distribution of the funding?
I would say probably, initially the law included a few, general requirements for, exactly the general types of funding that and projects that would be funded. But it's, like Sean said too, some of these on the DOT side and some of these on the EPA side, they're going to move by traditional formula or allocation to the states, and then it's up to each state to decide its own priorities. So unfortunately, it really kind of depends up to California. And just like Fred said, Colorado's list is going to be different than California's list. So it will depend on each state to some degree.
I've got an important one here, which is will appropriations match the authorization level? And what will a change of administration do to programs and projects? Any thoughts?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think in general, it's very difficult for any president to, especially with an authorization bill, to actually propose funding levels that are below what is already in law, the levels that are already in law. And so that's the way that this would work, is that the initial recommendation for funding each year would be in the president's proposed budget that he or she will transmit to Congress. And then it's really up to the congressional appropriators in the House and the Senate to determine what actual levels they will set for each of these programs. But historically, we have not seen congressional appropriators provide less than what is actually allocated for in an authorization bill. And so I think it's important to remember that, there's that political element. These numbers are already in law. And with the those programs in the highway side and the transit side that are actually subject to the Highway Trust Fund, in effect, the budget authority for those programs has actually already been provided. And so it's unlikely, I would say, that a president, even if it's of another party, proposes funding levels that are lower than what is in the bipartisan infrastructure law. But then you have to remember, Congress has different majorities than, the White House oftentimes. And so it's really going to be up to Congress to set those levels before they actually go to the president for signature.
Thanks, Sean. I want to give sort of equal time to all sectors out here. We've got one question from an appraiser who says, will there be an anticipated demand increase for appraisers due to the proposed act?
I think so. I think many of these programs have increased need for right-of-way acquisition, which would trigger the appraisal process. So anytime you put this much increased fund on infrastructure development, I think we're going to see that.
I think that pretty much covers all of the questions asked. There's a couple more that have been answered already, and they're somewhat duplicative. If there are no other questions coming into our chat box here, I'm going to go ahead and thank everyone for your attendance. Very much appreciate your spending your afternoon with us. Remember, you will get the handout or the PowerPoint presentation emailed out to you. If you need CLE, be sure to complete the forms, and we'll make sure we take care of that for you. And if you have not signed up for NOSSMN's e-alerts or our blogs, be sure to do so, because all of these topics are covered, I'd say pretty much on a daily basis. There's a posting about, relative to right-of-way acquisitions and infrastructure bills and what may be going on in Capitol Hill. So be sure to follow our blogs and our e-alerts and sign up for those. And if you have any questions, you've got all of the panelists' email addresses there on the presentation, so feel free to reach out to any one of us. Thank you again for attending.